Welcome to Void Histories. Here, we wander slowly through the corridors of time, not rushing, not chasing, but listening to the quiet echoes that history leaves behind. Tonight, we turn to a story heavy with silence and sorrow. Portuguese Angola, a colony of forced labor. It is not only a record of empire and conquest, but of lives reshaped by chains, of families broken, of memories carried forward in whispers and resilience. History is never just the past, it lingers in the present, in the wounds that never fully heal, in the strength that refuses to disappear. So rest here a while. Let the rhythm of these words guide you into reflection, and stay with us as we step gently into the shadows of memory to hear what the past still has to teach. Portuguese Angola, colony of forced labor. Before the sound of chains and commands echoed through the valleys of Angola, there was a land alive with its own rhythm, a place where life flowed with quiet dignity. The rivers, winding gently from the highlands to the Atlantic coast, nourished the villages scattered along their banks. Forests stretched wide, filled with the hum of insects and the songs of birds at dawn, while open plains carried the footprints of cattle and the laughter of children. This was a world not untouched by hardship, but it was a world whole unto itself, shaped by cycles of planting, of rain and drought, of festivals that bound people to their ancestors and to each other. The people of Angola lived in communities bound by kinship, guided by elders whose wisdom carried the memory of generations. Agriculture sustained them. Cassava, millet, and beans grown in the fertile earth, harvested with patience, shared with gratitude. Hunting and fishing tied them to the rhythm of the seasons, while cattle, like in so much of Africa, were more than wealth. They were the living heart of family bonds, dowries, and ritual offerings. At dusk, when the fires were lit, voices rose in song, carrying across the fields with drums that marked both celebration and remembrance. In these moments, the past and the present met, and identity was carried forward through story, through dance, through ritual. Spirituality infused daily life. Ancestors were not gone, but present, guiding, watching, speaking through dreams and ceremonies. The earth itself was sacred, a gift to be honored, a place that gave life and demanded respect in return. In this balance between the living, the land, and the spirits, Angolans found their belonging. They did not live as fragments, but as part of a fabric woven together by tradition, by land, by memory. Kingdoms and chieftaincies stretched across the land: Congo in the north, Ndongo in the center, Matamba, Benguela, and many others, each with its own leaders, its own rhythms, its own pride. These were not kingdoms without rivalry, but they were societies with structure, order, and identity. Authority was respected, power negotiated, life lived in accordance with long held ways. To be Anglen, in those times before foreign intrusion, was to know both one's place in the family and one's place in the wider harmony of community. It is important to imagine this world clearly, for only then can we understand the depth of what was lost. Before Portuguese ships landed on the coast, before treaties and wars and labor demands, there was this Angola, alive with continuity, with beauty, with dignity. It was a life where identity was intact, where children grew up with songs of ancestors rather than the commands of overseers, where families were shaped by choice, not by chains. And yet, across the sea, forces were stirring. In Portugal and across Europe, kingdoms grew restless with hunger for wealth that could not be satisfied at home. They looked outward, across oceans, toward lands rich in resources and people. The Atlantic, once a barrier, became a bridge for conquest. Ships prepared to sail not only with goods to trade, but with ambitions to conquer, to exploit, to reshape other worlds into extensions of empire. The Angola that stood whole in its own identity would soon feel the shadow of these ambitions. The coast that had once welcomed fishermen would welcome ships with flags of empire. The villages that had once feared only the hardship of drought would come to fear raids in the night. The balance between people, land, and ancestors would be broken by forces that recognized none of these bonds. For now, though, we pause in the memory of that earlier time, a time when Angola was its own, when life was lived with continuity, when songs and drums rose freely into the night sky. It is only by remembering this peace, this wholeness, that we can understand the depth of the wound that followed. For history is not only about conquest, it is also about what was broken, what was stolen, what was silenced. And in remembering, we begin to hear the heartbeat of a people who would soon endure one of the darkest chapters of their history. The first arrival of the Portuguese on the shores of Angola did not come with thunder, but with sails gliding across the horizon. To the villagers who saw them, these ships seemed almost like giant birds, their wings stretched wide against the wind. The men who stepped onto the sand carried goods unfamiliar, bright fabrics, beads, and metals shaped into tools. They spoke in strange tongues, smiled with promises of trade, and extended their hands as though offering friendship. At first, the encounters seemed cautious but not hostile. Exchanges of ivory and spices for mirrors and knives, gestures that suggested curiosity more than conquest. But beneath the surface of these exchanges lay a hunger deeper than trade. The Portuguese did not see the land and its people as equals in an exchange of gifts. They saw wealth to be taken, resources to be extracted, and lives to be reshaped into labor. Slowly, unease began to grow. Villages near the coast noticed that some of their people never returned after dealings with the foreigners. Families whispered of raids at night, of sons and daughters taken, of ships that vanished into the ocean, carrying with them voices that would never be heard again. What began as isolated incidents soon became a pattern. The Portuguese presence grew heavier. Forts rising on the coast, soldiers stationed to enforce new orders, missionaries preaching not only of salvation, but of obedience. They came not only with goods, but with weapons, and their intentions unfolded with greater clarity. The coast was no longer just a place of trade, it was becoming a place of capture, a gateway through which Angola's children were carried away into the Atlantic slave trade. The kingdoms inland, at first uncertain, began to realize the danger. Ndongo, Congo, and others tried to negotiate, tried to hold back the tide of empire with diplomacy. Kings and chiefs signed agreements, offered gifts, sought balance. But these agreements were not written in equality. They were shaped to benefit Portugal, binding Angolan rulers into systems that eroded sovereignty. A treaty signed was often a freedom lost, a promise of peace that turned into a chain. The impact rippled through daily life. Villages that once lived without fear of strangers now watched the horizon with dread. Parents kept their children close, fearing they might be taken. Communities fractured as some allied with the Portuguese for weapons and power, while others resisted, trying to defend their lands and people. Suspicion grew where there had once been unity, and the web of trust that bound societies began to fray. The Portuguese also began to demand labor directly. They sought men to build, to carry, to toil in plantations and mines. At first, these demands were small, hidden beneath the language of alliance, but soon they became obligations enforced by law, turning free people into forced laborers. What had once been voluntary exchange became coercion. What had once been partnership became domination. The land itself bore witness to these changes. Fields that had once grown crops for families now fed the needs of colonial markets. Rivers that had once been borders between kingdoms became pathways for conquest, patrolled by ships flying foreign flags. The sacred balance between land, people, and ancestors was broken, disrupted by outsiders who neither understood nor respected it. And yet, even in these early days, resistance stirred. Some refused to yield their people, hiding families in forests or leading them further inland. Some chiefs spoke openly against Portuguese demands, while warriors prepared themselves for the battles they knew must one day come. Angola was not conquered in silence. Its people carried defiance in their hearts, even as the shadow of empire pressed closer. The beginning of conflict was not a single battle. It was a slow unraveling, a creeping intrusion that turned trust into fear, promises into betrayal. It was the quiet realization that what had seemed like visitors had come not to share, but to stay, not to trade, but to rule. And so, as the sun set on those first years of Portuguese presence, Angola stood at the edge of a long night. A night filled with chains, with labor demanded and dignity denied. A night that would stretch across generations. But within that night, embers of resistance already glowed, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Conflict, once only a whisper in the distance, soon grew louder in the hearts of the Angolan people. What had begun as cautious exchange with the Portuguese was now unmistakably a contest of power. The raids, the abductions, the demands for labor, these were not isolated events, but patterns of domination. And though the colonizers carried muskets and cannons, the people of Angola were not without resolve. Resistance began to stir, sometimes quietly, sometimes in fire and steel. The kingdom of Nongo, under Queen Jinga, known in memory as Njingambande, emerged as one of the fiercest voices of defiance. She saw with sharp clarity that the Portuguese sought not friendship, but conquest, not alliance, but control. With strategy and cunning, she resisted. She negotiated when needed, but when betrayed, she turned to battle. Njinga's warriors fought in forests and marshlands, striking at Portuguese garrisons, refusing to yield. She built alliances with neighboring peoples, weaving unity from the threads of shared suffering. In her defiance, she became a symbol. Her name carried on the lips of those who believed that Angola would not be surrendered without a fight. Elsewhere, rebellion rose in smaller waves. Villages attacked Portuguese outposts, warriors struck at convoys, and captives broke free when the chance appeared. The land itself became a weapon, dense forests hiding movements, rivers serving as barriers, mountains sheltering the defiant. Though the Portuguese had superior weapons, they struggled to conquer a people bound not only by loyalty to leaders, but by the memory of their ancestors and the sacredness of their land. The wars, however, carried terrible cost. For every victory tasted by the Angolan people, there came reprisals marked with cruelty. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, captives punished with the brutality meant to terrify others into silence. Families that had fought to keep their children safe now found themselves scattered, their homes turned to ash. The message from the colonizers was clear. Resistance would be met with punishment not just for warriors, but for entire communities. Yet even under such weight, the flame of defiance did not vanish. Jinga continued her struggle for decades, mastering both warfare and diplomacy, refusing to bow even as the tide pressed harder against her. Her story became a beacon, reminding Angolans that resistance was not only possible but necessary. Even after her death, the echo of her defiance lingered, carried forward in memory, in song, in whispered stories that fueled courage in generations yet to come. The first wars between Portugal and Angola were not wars of equals. They were wars of survival, of dignity, defended with spears against rifles, of sovereignty challenged by empire. And though the Portuguese gained ground, establishing forts, tightening their grip on coastal regions, they never entirely extinguished rebellion. The Angolan people, scattered yet unbroken, carried their resistance into the forests, into the hills, into the marrow of memory itself. In the quiet of night, around fires hidden deep in the bush, families told stories of those who had risen, of those who had fought and fallen. These stories were more than remembrance. They were seeds planted in the hearts of children, teaching them that their people were not only victims but fighters, not only conquered but defiant. The wars carved wounds, but they also carved resilience, embedding into the soul of Angola the knowledge that identity, once threatened, could still endure. The first clashes were only the beginning of a longer struggle, but they revealed a truth that empire could never fully suppress, that the will to be free, though beaten and bloodied, cannot be entirely destroyed. The Portuguese may have claimed victory in treaties and fortified settlements, but the spirit of Angola lived on in its resistance, in its leaders, and in the countless unnamed who chose to fight rather than bow. As the wars quieted into uneasy truces and painful agreements, the people of Angola carried both scars and pride. Scars for what they had lost: land, lives, stability; pride for what they had proven, that they were a people unwilling to surrender without struggle. And though the battles of the first wars ended, the deeper conflict was far from over. The storm of empire was only just beginning, and Angola would face many more years of forced labor, exploitation, and sorrow. But even in the shadow of what was to come, the embers of defiance continued to glow, quiet, hidden, yet alive, waiting for the day they would rise once again. The first clashes between the Portuguese and the people of Angola did not end the struggle. They only opened the door to a conflict that would stretch across centuries, weaving sorrow into the land like a thread that could not be pulled free. The Portuguese, though bloodied by uprisings and resistance, did not withdraw. Instead, they tightened their grip, returning again and again with more soldiers, heavier weapons, and strategies meant not only to conquer, but to divide. The wars became a rhythm, battles flaring, treaties signed, betrayals uncovered, resistance rising again. It was not a single war, but a cycle of struggle that wore down both land and people. For the Portuguese, Angola was too valuable to abandon. Its coast gave access to the Atlantic slave trade, and its interior promised riches of ivory, minerals, and fertile soil. For this, they were willing to wage war endlessly, no matter the human cost. They struck not only at armies, but at the very fabric of communities, burning villages, seizing cattle, forcing people into labor. They sought to break the unity of kingdoms like Ndongo and Congo, offering some leaders weapons and alliances while punishing others. This strategy of division cut deeply, sowing mistrust between neighbors who had once stood side by side. In response, resistance continued. Leaders rose again and again, refusing to yield entirely, gathering warriors in forests and mountains, carrying on the fight even when the odds were impossible. But with each rebellion came reprisals, and with each reprisal came treaties written under duress, documents signed not out of free will, but out of exhaustion, hunger, and the desire to spare communities from further suffering. These treaties were rarely honored with fairness. They often promised peace but delivered humiliation. Land was ceded, authority fragmented, sovereignty eroded. A ruler who signed hoped to preserve his people, yet often found himself trapped, his power weakened, his people still conscripted into labor. For Portugal, these treaties were victories on paper, symbols of empire extending its reach. For Angola, they were bitter compromises, wounds disguised as agreements, scars pressed into the heart of the nation. The wars left behind more than burned villages and broken promises. They reshaped the very landscape of life. Fields once tended freely now lay under foreign demand. Men and women who had been farmers, hunters, and traders were forced into roles as laborers for plantations, carriers for armies, miners for wealth that did not belong to them. Children grew up watching their parents toil for others, their futures already chained by obligations not of their choosing. The cycle of war and treaty did not only exhaust the body, it drained hope, reshaping generations in the shadow of loss. Yet, even within these painful years, endurance lived quietly. Stories of resistance were carried forward, whispered in secret, told to children so they would not forget who they were. Songs remembered victories, even small ones, as proof that the spirit of the people had not been extinguished. The treaties may have marked defeats in ink, but memory preserved defiance in firelight. The prolonged wars were not only about land and power, they were about identity itself. To the Portuguese, Angola was a colony, a resource, a possession. To the Angolans, it remained a homeland, sacred, ancestral, not to be surrendered. This conflict of vision could not be resolved by treaties, for no piece of paper could erase the bond between a people and their land. And so, the wars continued, flaring across decades, each generation inheriting both the pain of loss and the duty of remembrance. When we look back upon these prolonged wars, we see not only the weight of empire pressing down, but the persistence of resistance rising up. We see the cruelty of betrayal, but also the endurance of identity. The treaties may have silenced battles, but they could not silence the quiet heartbeat of defiance that continued beneath the surface. And as the wars gave way to uneasy lulls, Angola moved into a new stage of suffering. No longer always at war, but never at peace. It was a life marked by forced labor, by fractured communities, by treaties that bound rather than freed. The land itself seemed to sigh beneath the weight, carrying forward wounds that would not easily heal. When the noise of battles quieted, when the treaties were signed and the armies withdrew to their forts, the heaviest wounds did not fade with silence. They settled into the lives of ordinary people, in the homes of farmers and mothers, in the lullabies of children who had never known freedom. The wars had scarred the land, but what they left behind in the hearts of Angolans was deeper still. These were the social wounds, invisible yet enduring, passed from one generation to the next like shadows that never lifted. Families bore the greatest weight. Fathers who had once tended cattle or fished the rivers were now forced into endless labor for the colonizers, marched away from their homes to toil in mines or carry goods across long distances. Mothers who had once sung with joy as they harvested crops now worked under the watchful eyes of overseers, their strength consumed not for their families, but for foreign markets. Children grew up with absence as their inheritance, watching parents leave and return weary, or sometimes not return at all. The home, once a sanctuary of belonging, became a place of waiting, of silence, of grief unspoken. Generations were lost to the demand for labor. The system of Chibalo, forced labor imposed by Portugal, meant that every able-bodied man was compelled to serve, often for years at a time, in conditions that drained both body and spirit. Fields back in the villages lay untended, families went hungry, and the cycle of poverty deepened. For every generation that rose, another was stolen by work they did not choose, by exhaustion that left no time for tradition, for memory, for the continuity of culture. What was taken was not only labor, it was time, it was dignity, it was the future that might have been. Culture itself bore the mark of these wounds. Rituals that had once been the heartbeat of life were interrupted, festivals subdued, songs silenced. Some traditions survived in whispers, carried secretly through stories and dances, kept alive in the dark of night, but much was fractured. Languages were pushed aside by Portuguese, names replaced, identities eroded. Children grew up learning to navigate two worlds: the world of their ancestors, weakened but enduring, and the world imposed by colonial rule, harsh and alien. The tension between these worlds became part of their inheritance, leaving them with questions of who they truly were. The land too carried its sorrow. Villages emptied as men were taken away, soil depleted by plantations that served distant markets, rivers redirected to power industries that brought no benefit to those who lived beside them. What had once been sacred, balanced, and sustaining became a tool of exploitation. And with the land weakened, the people weakened too, for the bond between them was more than practical. It was spiritual. To see the earth stripped bare was to feel the ancestors dishonored, to sense a rupture that could not easily be repaired. And yet, even within the weight of these wounds, there was resilience. Mothers taught children songs even while their hands worked for others. Elders whispered stories by firelight, even if the gatherings had to be small, cautious, hidden. Families, though broken, clung fiercely to fragments of their culture, ensuring that something of themselves survived. This quiet endurance became its own form of resistance, not through battles fought with weapons, but through memory preserved against silence. But still, the cost was immense. Whole generations grew up in the shadow of forced labor, knowing more of toil than of joy, more of obedience than of freedom. They were generations marked by loss, of fathers absent, of traditions weakened, of futures limited. These were the lost generations, shaped not by their own choices, but by the commands of empire. Their silence was not emptiness, it was grief, it was endurance, it was the weight of history carried in every step. The social wounds of Angola under Portugal were not temporary. They lingered, stretching across time, shaping the lives of those who came after. They left behind a legacy not only of suffering, but also of resilience, of identity preserved in fragments, of hope that refused to vanish entirely. And so, as we reflect on these generations, we see both sorrow and strength. We see lives diminished by labor, but also souls unbroken by empire. We see what was lost, but also what endured. These wounds remind us that history is never only about armies and treaties. It is about families, about children, about the quiet persistence of humanity even in the darkest times. When we reach the end of Angola's long night under Portugal, what remains is not the clash of armies, nor the ink of treaties, but the silence left in their wake. It is a silence heavy with memory, a silence filled with the voices of those who labored, who resisted, who endured, even when the weight of empire pressed hard upon their shoulders. The story of Portuguese Angola is not simply about conquest and control. It is about wounds that cut across generations, about lives reshaped by forced labor, about dignity that was tested but not destroyed. History often records the actions of rulers, the agreements of states, the rise and fall of empires. But beneath those records, hidden in the shadows of archives, lie the deeper truths. The grief of mothers waiting for absent sons, the hunger of families whose fields lay untended while fathers were marched away to work, the whispered stories of elders who tried to preserve fragments of culture even when silence was demanded. These are the truths that cannot be measured in treaties or numbers. They are felt in memory, in scars that remain invisible to the eye but alive in the heart. And yet, Angola's story is not one only of suffering, it is also one of resilience. Even as forced labor drained generations, even as culture was fractured, Even as language and identity were pressed under colonial weight, something survived. In songs sung softly at night, in rituals carried out in secret, in stories whispered from grandmother to child, the spirit of Angola endured. This endurance was itself a form of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the empire's attempt to erase. It reminds us that even in the darkest night, the human spirit seeks a way to continue. The lesson of Portuguese Angola is not confined to the past. It echoes into the present. The social wounds left by centuries of forced labor, of exploitation, of treaties written in betrayal, still shape identities and struggles today. The lost generations are not gone entirely. They live in the echoes of culture disrupted, in the poverty inherited, in the fractures of memory. To understand Angola now, one must understand the Angola that was, an Angola scarred by empire, but also one that carried resilience across time. Reflection on this history is not meant to reopen old sorrows, but to recognize them, to honor them, to learn from them. For history is never simply behind us. It lingers in the way nations grow, in the way families remember, in the way cultures heal. The story of Portuguese Angola teaches us that empire, though powerful, is never absolute. It can wound, it can scar, but it cannot entirely erase. What remains, memory, culture, resilience, becomes the foundation for healing, for continuity, for the quiet rebuilding of dignity. As we let this story settle into stillness, imagine the land once more, the rivers flowing as they always have, the forest whispering in the wind, the plains stretching wide beneath the evening sky. These landscapes have carried sorrow, but they also carry endurance. They remind us that while empire may impose, the earth remembers, and the people remember too. Tonight, as we close this chapter, let us hold on to the truth that Angola's history is more than its wounds. It is also its survival. It is also its capacity to endure, to adapt, to keep alive the ember of identity even when storms try to extinguish it. And in remembering, we honor not only the pain, but also the persistence, not only the scars, but also the strength. The story of Portuguese Angola is a story of labor forced, of dignity denied, of generations wounded, but it is also a story of resilience that refused to vanish, a resilience that still whispers through the songs and languages, the dances and traditions, the memories that have survived. And so, we leave this tale not with despair, but with contemplation, with the reminder that history carries lessons, that memory carries weight, and that endurance carries hope. The wounds remain, but so does the light. And perhaps, in remembering, we allow those wounds to teach us compassion, to remind us of the cost of empire, and to guide us gently toward a future where such shadows no longer fall.